Click. That's the heavy, industrial thud of a steel padlock snapping shut on the only gate to my property, and it's a sound that'll haunt me until the day they put me in the ground. The crunch of gravel under the boots of some hired security thugs as they walk away, leaving me trapped in my own home like some kind of common criminal, while the faint whiff of diesel exhaust from their trucks hangs in the thin mountain air. It was the moment I realized my life was no longer my own. You see, I'm Silas Vance, just a 60-year-old guy who wanted to spend his final chapters in peace on the land my family's worked for nearly a century. But apparently, Brenda Thorne, with her perfect teeth, her $1,000 clipboards, and her obsession with, in quote, community standards, in quote, had other plans for me. She branded my cabin an eyesore, labeled me a squatter on my own inheritance, and literally locked me behind a steel fence. But what Brenda and her board of cronies didn't oppose, bothered checking their fancy records, was the truth about the old stone bridge that every single one of them uses to get home. That bridge is the only way in and the only way out for all 45 luxury estates in this valley. And, as it turns out, I own every single ounce of that concrete and rebar. And if you've ever wondered what happens when an HOA picks a fight with a man who has nothing left to lose and a deed from 1938 in his hand, well, pull up a chair because you and Oppos, we're about to find out. 6 months ago, I thought the worst day of my life had already come and gone when I buried my wife, Clara, after nearly 40 years of being joined at the hip, leaving me with this hollow ache in my chest that felt bigger than the mountains themselves. I couldn't in Oppos. Stay in the city, couldn't in Oppos. Breathe in that house we built together with all her half-finished garden projects staring back at me. So I packed up my life and moved out to the old family acreage in Cedar Ridge, a place where the air smells like wet pine and the wind sounds like a low whistle through the canyons. My grandfather built this cabin with his bare hands, dragging the stones from the creek one by one. And to me, it was a sanctuary, but to the people moving into the, in quote, estates at Cedar Ridge, in quote, next door I was just a fly in their organic, gluten-free ointment. See, the estates is one of those places where the houses look like they were carved out of expensive butter, all beige and glass, and the residents are mostly weekend warriors who wear designer flannel and pretend to be mountain men until they see a spider. We had an informal neighborhood association for things like snow plowing and maintaining the shared road, which was fine until Brenda Thorne moved in from the suburbs of Chicago and decided she was born to rule over everyone within a 50-mile radius. Brenda is 55, sharp-edged, and looks like she's perpetually about to ask for a manager even when she's standing in her own kitchen, and she didn't in Oppos waste any time. Within 6 months, she maneuvered herself into the position of HOA president, running on a platform of, end quote, elevating our collective value, end quote, which is really just code for, end quote, getting rid of people like me, end quote. The first time I met her, I was out in the workshop fixing a rusted-out tractor engine, grease up to my elbows, and I heard the unmistakable click-clack of designer heels on my wooden porch, a sound that just doesn't into Oppos. Belong in the woods. I wiped my hands on a rag and stepped out to see her standing there with her son, Hunter, a 20-something kid with a smirk that made my fist itch, and she didn't in Oppos even say hello. She just opened a leather-bound folder and looked at my house like it was a pile of trash. End quote, Mr. Vance, end quote. She said, her voice like ice water, end quote. I'm here about your property compliance violations, specifically the end Oppos, industrial debris in Oppos, in your yard, and the fact that your cabin has an Oppos been painted in what looks like decades, end quote. I just looked at her, then at my grandfather in Oppos, as 40 acres. The workshop where 3 generations of Van Cess have built everything from cribs to coffins, and the garden that had fed my family since the Great Depression. I told her, end quote, Brenda, this cabin is hand-hewn cedar, it doesn't into Oppos. Need paint, it needs to be left alone. And that into Oppos, debris in Oppos, is a 1950s John Deere that'll still be running when your Tesla is a paperweight, end quote. But she just smiled that sharp, glass-shattering smile of hers and told me that progress requires sacrifice and sentimentality doesn't end Oppos. Pay the bills. 2 weeks later, the war started in earnest when I found a certified letter in my mailbox from the county saying an anonymous citizen had reported me for, end quote, unpermitted structures, end quote. And suddenly I had a nervous kid in a county uniform telling me my workshop, the one my dad built in 1962, needed a modern architectural survey, and $4,500 in retroactive permit fees. It was a shot across the bow, a message that Brenda Thorne had friends in high places and she wasn't oppos. T gonna stop until I was priced out of my own history. But what she didn't in oppos, T realized, is that the Vancests are like the old hemlocks on this ridge. We have deep roots and we don in oppos. T sway just because the wind starts blowing. I paid the fees, grinding my teeth as I signed the check, thinking that would be the end of it. But 3 days later, I woke up to the sound of surveying equipment and Hunter Thorne standing on the edge of my meadow, pointing at my old oak tree like it was a target. They claimed that after resurvey of community green space, my property line was actually 20 feet closer to the cabin than it had been for the last 80 years. And before the sun had even set, a crew was out there driving fence posts into the frozen earth, right through the middle of the trail where I used to walk with Clara every evening. The fence was 8 feet high, a wall of gray plastic that blocked the morning sun from my workshop and made me feel like I was living in a cage, and every time I heard the thud of those posts going in, it felt like a stab at my memories. My neighbor, an old soul named Mrs. Gable who's lived here as long as I have, came over with a thermos of coffee and whispered that everyone was terrified of Brenda, that she'd already hounded 2 other families into selling their homes at a loss just because she didn't end oppos, T like their landscaping. She and oppos, S.A. Predator, Silas, she told me, looking over her shoulder as if Brenda were hiding in the bushes, she wants her land for that new developer project, those luxury condos they into oppos. You've been talking about at the board meetings, That was the moment the grief in my chest turned into a slow, hot burn of anger, and I realized I wasn't into oppos. T just fighting for a cabin. I was fighting for the soul of the mountain. I'm an engineer by trade, or at least I was before I retired, and if 40 years of building dams and roads taught me anything, it's that infrastructure has a long memory, and the devil is always buried in the fine print of old, dusty maps that people like Brenda think are irrelevant. I spent 3 days in my grandfather and Oppo's workshop, digging through old wooden crates filled with brittle yellow papers, mining claims and water rights. And that's when I found the, golden ticket, a hand-drawn deed from the 1930s with a county seal that looked like it had been stamped by a ghost. It wasn't Oppo's, just a property map. It was an exclusive easement and maintenance title for the, Creek Crossing, the very spot where the estates at Cedar Ridge had built their grand, ornamental stone bridge back in the 90s. You see, the HOA had assumed the bridge was on community land, but according to this deed and the county archives I visited on Monday, the bridge sat entirely on a private parcel owned by the Vance estate, and every legal filing since 1978 confirmed that the, shared road, only existed by the grace of my family. I went to the next HOA meeting on Tuesday night, sitting in the back of the room while Brenda clicked through a PowerPoint presentation about, finding non-compliant residents, looking like a corporate executioner in a pantsuit. When she finally got to the slide about my, illegal encroachment, and the $500 monthly fines they were imposing on me, I stood up, my voice steady but feeling like a low-pressure system before a storm. Brenda, I said, before you vote on those fines, you might want to take a look at who actually owns the ground underneath that bridge you drove over to get here tonight. Spoiler alert, it's not you and it's definitely not the HOA. The look of dawning horror on her face was worth every cent of those permit fees. But Brenda, I ascend into oppos. T the type to surrender. She's the type to double down until the world catches fire. Within 48 hours, she launched a harassment campaign that would make a dictator blush. Suddenly, my handmade cedar mailbox was a, violation of aesthetic harmony, my trash was in oppos. T being picked up because of, route efficiency, and the fire marshal was at my doorbell. Because an anonymous tipster claimed my woodpile was a public hazard. She even started rumors at the local diner that I was losing my mind, that I was a dangerous old man who shooed into oppos. TB living alone, trying to build a case to have me removed from my own, safety, But while she was playing mailbox dictator, I was working with a property rights attorney named Julian Thorne, no relation to Brenda, much to his relief, and a forensic accountant who started pulling the thread on the HOAs, Maintenance and Infrastructure Fund, end quote. What we found was a crime scene in a spreadsheet. It turned out that for 12 years, the HOA had been collecting $200,000 a year for bridge maintenance that was never performed, and that money was flowing directly into a shell company owned by Brenda's son, Hunter. They weren't an oppos. Just bullies. They were common thieves who had stolen nearly $3 million from their own neighbors while I was sitting on my porch minding my own business. The tension reached a breaking point on a Friday morning when I returned from the grocery store to find the electronic gate at the entrance to the estates had been modified. A new keypad had been installed, and my code, the one I'd used since I moved in, was dead. I sat there in my truck, the red light on the intercom blinking at me like a robotic eye, while a security guard, a guy who looked like he'd failed the police academy twice, told me through the speaker that my access had been, end quote, suspended pending legal resolution of property disputes, end quote. I was locked out of my own land, unable to get to my house, while my neighbors drove past me, some of them looking away in shame and others, like Hunter Thorne, smirking as they waved their key fobs. That was the last straw. I didn't in oppos. Get angry, I didn't in oppos. Shout. I just picked up my phone and called the one person who could turn Brenda's world upside down, the regional director of the Department of Transportation. You see, when a private bridge that serves 45 homes is found to have, end quote, critical structural neglect, end quote, and the owner of the land, that's me, revokes the easement for safety reasons, the state has to step in, and Brenda Thorne was about to find out that, end quote, unlawful restraint, end quote, is a felony in this state. Monday night's emergency HOA meeting was the most crowded event in the history of Cedar Ridge. People were standing in the aisles. The local news crew was hovering by the doors, and Brenda was at the podium, looking frantic, her hair perfectly coiffed but her eyes darting around like a cornered animal. She tried to start the meeting by claiming I was, end quote, holding the community hostage, end quote, but I just walked to the front and handed out 47 manila folders, one for every household in the valley. Inside wasn't an oppos, just the deed to the bridge. It was a forensic audit showing exactly how much of their dues had gone into Hunter's pocket. The, end quote, safety condemnation, end quote, notice from the state inspector, and photos of the crumbling foundation of the bridge that Brenda had ignored for years. I looked at my neighbors, people like the Garcas who had been fined for their vegetable garden, and the Pattersons who had moved out in tears, and I told them, end quote, I'm not the one holding you hostage. The woman at the podium is, and she's been doing it with your own money, end quote. The silence in that room was so heavy you could have heard a pin drop on a velvet rug, until Mrs. Gable stood up and asked the question that broke the dam, end quote. Brenda, where is the $3 million, end quote. The fallout was spectacular and, I'll admit, deeply satisfying. Brenda tried to scream about a conspiracy, about, end quote, fake news, end quote, and, end quote, legal technicalities, end quote, but the sheriff's deputies were already waiting in the back of the room. They didn't in oppos. Just arrest her for the gate stunt. They brought her in on charges of wire fraud, embezzlement, and racketeering, and by the time they let her out in handcuffs, the entire room was standing and cheering. Her son Hunter didn't in oppos. Fare much better. He was picked up the next morning trying to clear out his business accounts, and even her husband, the, end quote, big shot, end quote, lawyer, was suddenly nowhere to be found, filing for divorce before the ink on the indictments was even dry. As for the bridge, I didn't in oppos. Shut it down. I'm not a monster, but I did sell the title and the easement back to the community for $1, on the condition that the HOA be permanently dissolved and replaced with a transparent, voluntary council that actually cares about the land instead of the property values. Now, when I sit on my porch in the evenings, the, end quote, estates at Cedar Ridge, end quote, feels like a different place. The gray plastic fence is gone, replaced by the old oak tree and the trail where I can walk and feel Clara's spirit in the mountain breeze. The, end quote, condo project, end quote, was scrapped. The land was turned into a nature preserve, and the only sound at night is the wind and the occasional neighbor stopping by with a pie or a, end quote, thank you, end quote, for the man who saved the mountain. But looking back on it all, I have to wonder, did I do the right thing by being so ruthless? I ruined a family. I sent a woman to prison, and I turned a quiet neighborhood into a headline-grabbing scandal, all because of a piece of paper from 1938. Some people say I'm a hero for standing up to a bully, but others say I was just as petty as she was, using my power to crush her just because she annoyed me. So, I'm curious to hear what you think. Was I justified in going for the nuclear option, and holding a whole community's access over their heads to get my revenge? Or did I become the very thing I was fighting against? Drop a comment below and let me know if you would have signed that easement or if you would have let the gates stay locked. And hey, if you've ever had an HOA nightmare of your own, share it, because sometimes the only way to beat a tyrant is to realize you're the one holding the keys to the bridge. Don and Oppos, don't forget to subscribe for more stories from the Ridge, and I'll see you in the next one.